Thanks for joining our XXpire insecticide and insect resistance management webinar today. I'm going to cover a little bit about an agenda. So we got three really important things we want to share with you guys today. And first up is some back to basics around integrated pest management. Then we also wanted to take a look a little bit about insect resistance management. And while they're certainly tied to IPM, there are some differences. We wanted to share those with you. And most importantly, we wanted to share with you some information about a product, XXpire insecticide. I wanted to also introduce everyone here today. I've got with me Amy Agee. She's our field scientist in the southern region, and myself, Brock Martindale. I'm a nursery and greenhouse strategic account manager with Corteva. I'm super excited to have Amy with us today because her and I get along so well when it's talking about bugs. We're going to hopefully keep this thing to under an hour and get you guys back out to your facilities. But when Amy and I start talking about bugs, you just never know what happens. So first up, I wanted to dig right into some information about integrated pest management. And I know you guys have probably heard lots of this before, but again, it's such an important part of putting together a really robust program that it's always good to have a little bit of review. So we're going to cover some things today, and then we'll get to it. So what is integrated pest management? It's really that sustainable approach to managing pests by combining biological, physical, and chemical tools in a way that minimizes economic, health, and environmental risk. So using integrated pest management, you really have a few key bullet points to think about. Identifying the pest, monitor the pest population, prevention, control, use the right registered insecticides only when needed, when maybe an action threshold is met, use labeled recommended doses, and then always seek expert advice, whether that's through industry extension or industry professionals. Scouting program. This is something I get pretty passionate about. I must say I have a lot of respect for those folks out there that have dedicated scouts, because I think that really does build a very robust program. So make sure you have a scout that can provide dedicated responsibility to regular monitoring. That means that person should have dedicated time in their day or week that's set aside for scouting. So that's a really, really important part of a good program. You want to establish this monitor and record keeping process. It's not good enough just to go out and mark down that you found a pest on a piece of paper and then simply do something about it. It's important to record the crop, the location, and dates and times of this, because this is all information that you could use in the following years when you want to be a little bit predictive of some of your challenges. This scouting data can absolutely help you make a better program. The other thing I think about is training other employees to identify pests. You can never have too many eyes looking for a pest in your facility. In fact, those of you that are in charge of people and manage people, make a game of this. Encourage people and reward them for finding something that isn't necessarily part of their job. Now, you may get a few too many text messages or emails associated to it. So you have to figure out that communication plan for yourself. But no joke, I think everybody in the facility should know what pests are being that your facility is dealing with, and be aware of them. I've got a grower that I just visited with this week and really like to see what they were doing. They send out an email to all of their employees every Friday with what the scouts were finding in the areas they were finding them in, and provided a very transparent look at IPM for their facility. I thought that was great, and really something that we should all probably be doing. Then the next one is that develop a communication plan. So the scout may or may not be the person assigned for making the control decisions. And so it's really important for you and that person to have some kind of a communication plan so that you get the information that you need, that you don't have to go back and have a lot of different follow-up questions. For instance, the crop, the location, the levels of infestation, all those key informations that you really do need to make that decision. So have a development plan so that you guys can communicate as a team, and the information comes from multiple people, it looks the same, so you can make those decisions. So we're going to cover a couple of those control methods. And so we talked a little bit about biocontrol. So many insect, mite, pests in floriculture crops have some natural enemies out there. Some of those are at the local level, and some of them actually are released or controlled releases. Using pesticides that don't disrupt natural enemies is really a key component of integrated pest program. And then biological control can be an important tool in the tool belt to help you start really clean. We notice a lot of folks using biocontrol in propagation as a way to get the plant started off clean. And then as the plants move through the supply chain, they'll potentially move off of biocontrol and into chemical control. That's a pretty normal path for a lot of plants. Mechanical and physical control is another method. Mechanical and physical controls kill the pest directly, or they block the pest out, or keep the environment unsuitable for it. So think about different things. Think about traps for rodents, example. That's a good example of mechanical control. And then physical controls include like mulches for weed management, steam sterilization for soil and disease management, or barriers such as screens to keep birds and insects out. Then lastly, chemical control. Chemical control is the use of pesticides. Pesticides are only used when needed in a combination with the other approaches we've already discussed for this really effective long-term control. Pesticides are selected and applied in a way that minimizes their possible harm to people and non-target organisms in the environment. So now that we have all of this good basic ideas about how an IPM program runs, I'm going to turn it over to Amy, and she's going to share with you guys some really important information as it comes to insect resistance management and some of the tools that can help you refine your program in the coming weeks, months, and years.
Thanks, Brock.
Yep.
Thank you. Thanks for having me today, and thanks to all of you for joining us. When Brock talks about insecticides or pesticides, chemical control as part of an IPM program, one of the things that we really need to think about is insecticide resistance management. And before we can even consider what management should look like, we need to talk a little bit about what is insecticide resistance. The formal definition of this is a heritable change in the sensitivity of a pest population reflected in the repeated failure of a product to achieve the expected level of control. Essentially, what that means is your insect pest population is no longer controlled at the dose or the rate that you used to be able to provide control with. So this is deemed insecticide resistance, and it becomes pretty much official once those resistant insects are able to reproduce and pass on those traits or insecticide resistance to their offspring. There's several different types of insect resistance mechanisms to insecticides. Primarily, you have target site resistance. So when an insecticide, when an insect encounters an insecticide, that insecticide can bind to certain target sites in the insect, and that is what basically kills the insect or slows down feeding or whatever it is to prevent damage. Well, if you have insecticide resistance with a target site, that insect may be genetically modified and to prevent that insecticide from binding or interacting at that particular site. So you've got a reduced effectiveness of the insecticide. Metabolic resistance is the most common mechanism. This is where you have resistant insects that can detoxify or destroy a toxin within faster than susceptible insects can do. So something about that particular insect allows it to rid their body of those toxic molecules faster than a susceptible insect. Insects, for example, will use internal enzyme systems to break down insecticides. Well, a resistant insect may have higher levels of those enzymes or be more efficient at using them. The third type of resistance mechanism is penetration resistance. You all know insects have what we call a hard exoskeleton, or their outer cuticle. That's like their skin and their skeleton all in one. That outer cuticle can slow the absorption of a broad range of chemicals. So oftentimes penetration resistance, though, is present with other forms of resistance. And then finally, we have behavioral resistance. And this is where a particular resistant insect may have some sort of behavior that allows them to detect or recognize a danger and thereby avoid that toxin. And they can then pass this on, this behavioral behavior that they have to their subsequent offspring. This type of resistance has been reported for a lot of different insecticides. More commonly, some of the ones that we currently have around would be the pyrethroids. Pyrethroids, however, insects have several different types of resistance to pyrethroids. For example, could be target site, could be metabolic, could be behavioral. So they can have lots of different ways of overcoming a particular pesticide or group of pesticides. So because of this, you guys have probably heard of IRAC, which stands for the Insecticide Resistance Action Committee. All of our companies you see listed here are members of IRAC or sponsors. We have people within our organization. Corteva is one of the companies you see listed here that sit on this committee and help make decisions around how we're going to keep our molecules around longer by preventing insecticide resistance. And one of the biggest responsibilities of IRAC is to classify insecticides based on modes of action. And we do this so that we can differentiate them. I'm going to show you some examples later and talk a little bit about these different types of groups. But on every chemical label, you'll see a group number that tells you what that insecticide is. And you can see, even though you can't read exactly what all the different groups are, but this is a visual to just give you an idea of all the different types of insecticide classifications there are. There's even at the bottom right of the chart here, unknown modes of action, but we know enough about the modes of action to know that they're different than the other ones that you see grouped here. And essentially every block on this chart is a different mode of action for an insecticide group. And even within those modes of action, we have subgroups. Okay. So when we think about nursery and greenhouse, one of the things we have to consider is that ornamental crops are short cycle crops, and that's essentially a treatment window. So those types of treatment windows or short cycle crops require rotation of different modes of action. You don't want to apply the same mode of action continuously throughout the growing season, and you also don't want to treat successive generations of the same pest with the same mode of action. So this is just an example of what that might look like in a nursery setting. If you consider, say it's 100 days of a crop, and you consider you've got your initial planting or transplanting, you have a couple of different upsizes or size increases of your plants until you're ready to sell. For the purposes of this demonstration, diamondback moth generations are shown here, but it could be any number of pests because a lot of the pests in the greenhouse have about a 28-day cycle. Some are different. Some can be a little bit less, some are a little bit more depending on the particular pest, and there can be different ranges with, among different species with different groups of insects. But for diamondback moth, you could consider in this 100 days about 3 different generations. Every 28 days, another generation. You definitely do not want to treat all 3 of these generations with the same mode of action. So you have 2 different options here. The first would be you could treat generation 1 with 1 mode of action, then go back with a second mode of action for the next generation, and then finally a 3rd mode of action. Or you could even treat with mode of action 1, switch to your 2nd mode of action, and then come back to that 1st mode of action that you used, as long as there's something in the middle to break it up. Another very important concept to consider with resistance management in a nursery setting is rotating as large an area as possible for your mode of action rotation strategy. So, you may have a group of plants over here on this particular visual. It could be field 1 is your first group of plants. You could have another over here on group field 4. You want to make sure you're treating that entire area with the same mode of action at the same time, if needed, because insects can move around your nursery and greenhouse settings over large areas.
Hey, Amy, before you move on,
Yep.
I got a question for you, and sorry to put this on the spot because we didn't even talk about this one, but it kind of came up recently. So We got growers that have some really large facilities, and we kind of consider it underneath one roof. However, they don't necessarily have the need to spray the entire facility. Maybe it's a block of plants. However, it is underneath one roof. Do you have any recommendations from a strategy perspective of, do I spray the entire, all the plants underneath one roof, or do I spray the spot spray? Any thoughts?
I think it depends on your target pest, Brock. You know, depending on what it is, sometimes we can even have areas where we need to treat the whole area for our particular situation, but you could have something around the nursery or greenhouse where, you know, your pest has a way to go outside of the nursery and then come back in. So
Sure.
that's where I think when we talk about IPM, where scouting is critical, because you need to know what you have before, during, and after these applications and stay on top of it.
Excellent. Thanks.
So when we talk about an insecticide resistance management plan, as I just said, scouting and pest ID before and after is critical. I mean, you don't know what to treat for if you don't know what you have. And you also need to pay attention to those action thresholds, because sometimes we may not need to treat at all because of our natural enemy populations, which you should also be monitoring inside your systems. They could be sufficient enough that they handle or take care of those pest populations for you without you having to do anything. So you're integrating those local IPM practices wherever possible. As we've said before, do not use the same mode of action over and over and over. That's the quickest way to lose that material for your particular program. So avoid the repeated sequential use of insecticides for season-long control, especially if you have more than one generation per crop per season. You want to use, like we talked about, for insects with multiple or overlapping generation, use that treatment windows approach where we talked about rotating more than one mode of action. We showed mode of action 1, 2, and 3, or mode of action 1, go back to 2, then come back to 1. You want to make sure you're targeting early or the most susceptible insect stages. And in most cases, this is going to be your immature insect populations. And in terms of, in the situation with Lepidoptera or caterpillar pests, for example, your smallest caterpillars. Something I'm going to address a little bit more detail is using insecticide mixtures. Sometimes insecticide mixtures can offer insecticide resistance management benefits when they're appropriately used in a rotation strategy. This can be in a pre-mix like our product XXpire that we're going to share a little more information about, or even a tank mix of some insecticides. And then if you suspect insect resistance in any of your systems, please let someone know. Reach out to your local company representative, reach out to somebody in extension at the university. Just let us know so that we can keep an eye on things. When we talked about mixtures, it's important that you understand the active ingredients that you're putting out. You want to know, Brock talked a little bit earlier about the label. The label has so much valuable information for you if you will just read it. You can understand the active ingredients, the use patterns, the targeted pest complex to consider. There are technical advantages sometimes for these mixtures in that you're increasing your level of targeted pest control, but you're also broadening the spectrum of control. So you may get more pest with a product like XXpire, for example. And then just in general, when you're considering mixtures, you want to make sure that the individual insecticides or the active ingredients that you're putting in the tank are highly effective for that particular target pest, and you want to make sure you're using the right rates for that pest. You want to make sure that your mixture components, we talked about the IRAC mode of action classification. Like I said, and I'll show you here in a slide or so, you'll have those numbers on every label. Make sure that you're not using the same mode of action classification in the tank all at once. You want to consider cross resistance issues between individual components. So sometimes you might have a group of insecticides with subgroups that are very different. Sometimes the insecticides within a particular group, if they're subgroups within a group, there can be cross resistance issues. One example, DDT, that we don't really use anymore. When the pyrethroids first came out, they realized that there was a lot of resistance issues with pyrethroids because they had resistance from overuse of DDT. That's because they were similar enough to have cross resistance, even though they were two different types of insecticides. And finally, your resistance management benefits are going to be the greatest if your components or your products you're putting in the tank have similar residual activity. So you don't want something that's got a 7-day residual with something that's got a 21-day residual, for example.
I think that's a really good point, because we do see some mixologists in the nursery or greenhouse, and they seem to sometimes have this while they're two really great products, they think that would be a great option to mix them together and create an even better product. But in this case, because they didn't have that similar residual activity, wasn't as effective as maybe it could have been.
Exactly. We often get the question in our company, you know, if I get resistance to an insecticide, am I going to have that resistance forever? Does that mean a total loss of this insecticide for me? And the answer to that is not necessarily. You know, we've had some issues in the past. I think out in California, for example, with Conserve, we had some issues with resistance with thrips. And at the time, this was many, many years ago, there weren't as many different options for thrips control for these growers. So it was repeated use of spinosad over and over and over. So what happened? We had a resistance issue with thrips. In order to break that cycle, though, sometimes you have to stop the use of it. And fortunately, at the time, some other chemistries came on the market. Some of these growers were able to introduce some other modes of action into their programs. And within a year or two, those growers were able to go back to using Conserve because they were able to break that cycle of resistance. So it doesn't happen all the time, but sometimes it does. And as long as you move away from certain modes of action, you can sometimes come back to it.
That's a really great point, because you know, here we are. I was making visits earlier this week, and the conversation was real, and it circled back around to, this was a new employee, new person into the industry, and they had been given some information about Conserve, and it was about resistance that the facility had years ago. But yet the new employee had experience with Conserve doing a great job. So they were kind of questioning and wanted to know what has changed. And what has changed is nothing on our end. We're still producing a good product that does what it says it does. However, what has changed is more products have come to market, making for a more robust rotation. And that's where the success comes from.
Yeah, that's a perfect example, Brock. So, like we talked about earlier, these mode of action group numbers on the product labels. Here is a picture of the XXpire label, for example, and we make it very easy for you. All the companies do. At the very top of the label, you should be able to see those group numbers. You can see here that sulfoxaflor is a group 4C, spinetoram is a group 5. With Conserve, that's another group 5. This is an example where with Conserve and XXpire, you can use both of them in a rotation program, but you wouldn't want to use them back to back, because XXpire has a group 5 and Conserve is a group 5. So in summary, it's very important that you understand these active ingredients, their use patterns, the targeted pest complex, and also understand that we as an industry are extremely motivated to promote insecticide resistance management as part of our product stewardship, because we want these products to be around and for you to be able to use them as much as you do. Again, the label is extremely important. Read it. There's information on the label specifically that addresses resistance management. So that should help guide your decisions. IRAC, this website listed here, has a wealth of information and resources to help you manage insecticide resistance. Similarly, for your herbicides and fungicides, there are websites for the Herbicide Resistance Action Committee and the Fungicide Resistance Action Committee. So those websites are available. bottom line is just in order for this to be successful, we need cooperation from all of our stakeholders, all of us working together to make sure that we keep these products around for as long as possible.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Amy. I feel like this, I mean, we can't talk enough about, the resistance management when we talk about whether any of our, insecticides, fungicides, or herbicides. It's just such an important piece of it. So I was really glad you were able to join us today a little bit and kind of talk about it. But as we're going to transition, we're going to talk a little bit about XXpire insecticide. So XXpire insecticide is an ornamental insecticide with 2 active ingredients. And Amy kind of talked a little bit about that earlier. So when we came up with the concept of bringing this product to market, we really wanted to better understand from both the nursery and greenhouse growers, what was missing, what's missing out there in the industry. And so, or what were important attributes to having a product. And so we did some market research, and a lot of the things listed below here are kind of what we heard from the growers. And so it was plant safety was really important. Obviously, you guys are growing beautiful, flourishing crops, and it's really important for us not to interfere with that. So products that are safe and are key. We don't get good as control as we would like. I think some of that maybe could have even been from resistance. So there could have been some issues there. And why did that happen? Well, maybe the program wasn't as robust as it could have been. Didn't have as many things in the rotation as it needed. The fewer applications during the season would be better. Every grower I've ever visited with, one of the very first things that they're challenged by is continued pressure of labor challenges. And so certainly keeping the need for the number of applications down would be key. The other one is re-entry intervals. With as busy as the green industry has been over the last several years, the need for low REI products is really important. Really much anything past that 12-hour mark is really a challenge. So we certainly understand that your concerns there. Growers at the same time had been using the same kind of families of chemistries for a long time. So again, goes back to the fact of rotation. The stuff that we used to use has been taken off the market. And yes, there has been a lot of products that have exited the marketplace, but at the same time, the products that are in existence today are way more targeted towards the pests that we're actually trying to control and have a lot more safety associated to them than the other products of years past. So good work on that part. We need better insecticides for the industry, hands down. We know that the ornamental industry has needs for more products, and we certainly continue to strive just like our competitors strive. But because of some of the intricacies of the crops that we all grow, that becomes some of the challenges too. So that plant safety becomes a real big one. It's not so hard to bring a single product to market. And for instance, an agricultural crop, corn, soy, something like that, when we have to involve hundreds of different varieties and species, there's where become the challenges. Needing an insecticide that covers a broad range of insects and doesn't hurt any of the good ones. And so again, I think the concept of anybody really probably doing a really good job of scouting probably finds a couple of different insects at different locations within their facility. And so being able to have something that has broad spectrum is certainly key. And then systemic activity. And systemic activities were really where you get some of the longevity, get the product to last the longest. So we took all this information in and we listened. And so that's when we, came up with a product like XXpire. So it is an ornamental insecticide. It has 2 active ingredients for ornamentals. It has 2 different modes of action, has a single word of caution, controls 39 insects, including 7 of the top 10 pests in nurseries and greenhouse. It's minimal phytotoxic risk to plants, less disruptive to beneficials, and virtually no odor. So let's dig into a little bit more about the 2 active ingredients. So sulfoxaflor is a group 4C. It is a non-neonic, and available data indicates a broad lack of cross-resistance in many sap-feeding insect strains resistant to other insecticides. So we do get some of the activity that you would have seen from neonics, and we know a lot of you are pressured into using products that are non-neonic, and so this certainly gives you an option in that space with similar kinds of results of control of pest. And then spinetoram. Spinetoram is a group 5, so similar to spinosades. They sit in that same group, but it is kind of like the next generation. So these two different modes of action will really increase the level of target pest control. It will broaden the spectrum of control of both chewing and sap-feeding insects. This reduces the likelihood of resistance and really offers another option for IPM rotations. Rotations between subgroups is recommended only if no options are available between the groups. So this is some exciting stuff when you actually get to look at 39 different insects. And so controlling both sap feeding and chewing pests, including the top 7. You got the sap feeding, thrips, aphids, whitefly, scale, mealybugs, lygus bugs, lace bugs, and even some spider mites. And then a long list of chewing insects. So Lepidoptera, sawflies, some more leaf-feeding beetles, and the list goes on and on. And so again, really broad spectrum application. In fact, to the point where you think about folks doing kind of mixing products in a tank, and although there's not been any issues with any mixtures that we have found in any of the testing that we've done, we also don't know that there's a big need to add another insecticide in with it with XXpire, just because the label is already so broad. However, we do have a lot of growers who are utilizing this as along with fungicides and have had no reports of any issues there. So I think the picture says it all. You know, this broad insect control of more than 39 insects. And in this case, we used beet armyworm on aster. And this just really shows after 7 days of the untreated plant, obviously looking pretty mangled and devoured. And 7 days after treatment with XXpire, light and completely different look to the plant. Certainly one is definitely going to make it to the sales shelf. Spider mite on marigold. And so, the spider mite, having some activity on spider mites is really key, because a lot of times when spider mites are present, there's also lots of other pests that are present. So being able to have something else to rotate in with your mite program is certainly key. On this one, for example, this is after 21 days of untreated with mites. And that's kind of like what you would expect to see in a mite infestation if you weren't doing anything about it. And then here's a list of 21 days with 2 treatments of XXpire at the 3.5 ounce per 100 gallon rate, and with an adjuvant 14 days apart. So again, really seeing some great results even with spider mites. So I'm going to let Amy weigh in on this, because this is right up her alley, but this is another one that I think that is really important for you guys to better understand, especially from the manufacturer side. So I wanted Amy to kind of weigh in a little bit on what goes into bringing a product to market when it talks a little bit about phytotoxicity and the safety side of the work that we do to bring products to market. Amy?
Yeah, so Brock and I have talked a lot about this over time, because a lot of times Brock is instrumental in helping us source the plants to do a lot of this testing. So before we even advance a concept in the turf and ornamental space to develop a new product or molecule, one of the first things we look at is phytotoxicity, because if we don't have plant safety, we don't have a product. So in the case of XXpire, for example, we know that we have no phyto on more than 300 different types of crops and ornamental plants, including delicate and ornamental or in flowering ornamentals. Not only is it safety, but we look at visible residue left on leaves and flowers, because that's what makes something marketable or not. In the case of XXpire, when it was originally developed, our studies have shown that we have safety up to 4 times the highest labeled rate. And in this case, it was 2 applications made 7 days apart. The label reads 14 days. But for the purposes of testing, we put it even closer together to make sure there was safety. These tests have been done not just with us in R&D at Corteva, but across the country, with organizations like IR4, their environmental horticulture group, and all the scientists that work with them to do these studies for us. Also, university, research and extension cooperators, private cooperators, but we do all of this testing. And typically, the way we do this, we just expand on it year to year. So even though you may not have something listed on the label, we may have some safety data to indicate that we're okay. Because as you all know, plants change, new ones become popular. So every year we basically will have a list. Okay, what do we need to test this year? What do we need to look at plant safety? For example, lately, some of the more common ones have been succulents that Brock, brings up here. Let's look at this. So that's kind of how we've done our safety testing over the last few years.
Excellent. I think that just gives a grower a little bit more reassurance, because I think that's one of the things that they want to know about. They want to know about how safe it is. And frankly, it's really challenging. Think about being all kind of suited up and ready to go to the greenhouse or out into the nursery, and think about having to figure out if there was plants that couldn't be sprayed, and how much of a risk there is in going out into that area and not knowing exactly what crops are need to be sprayed and which ones are susceptible. And so being able to have a label that's as robust as this with 300 or more varieties is super important. Thanks, Amy.
Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about some other features. So I think another one that's really important to the nursery side, especially, rain fast. Rain fast in 3 hours. So in case of whether it's rain and or irrigation cycles, you can feel safe that after 3 hours, you can feel confident that the product is actually in the plant, taking care of the plant, and that you're not just washing it off. There is no evidence of outbreaks or flaring of secondary pests that have been observed. This is less disruptive to beneficials. No significant impact on certain parasitic insects or natural predaceous arthropods, complex and treated ornamentals, including big-eyed bugs, ladybird beetles, flower bugs, lacewings, and minute pirate bugs. However, those of you that are utilizing beneficials probably should do a double check to be sure that what species you're using actually are safe. And a lot of the biological companies have the risk sections of their websites that you can enter in the products that you're using chemical wise into their database, and it will talk about the safety on which ones are safe and which ones are not. Bee sustainability is something that we're all really concerned about. So no concerns for bees and native pollinators for greenhouse applications. However, with nursery applications, the risk of pollinators is greatly reduced after 3 hours of drying time. So this isn't much different verbiage than what's out there on the other products. But one of the things to think about is, is there abilities to do things a little bit different? And in this case, risk to manage bees or native pollinators from contact with pesticide sprays or residues can be really minimized when the applications are made 2 hours prior to sunset, or when the temperature is below 50 degrees at the site application. And this is definitely some guidance that has been put out as producers of pesticides have gotten more understanding and some of the requirements required. So we're going to move into some restrictions. And so these are the greenhouse restrictions associated to the use of XXpire. So do not apply to any stage of an edible crop. Even though some of the products have, some safety in some other products, XXpire is only labeled on ornamentals. No restriction relative to applications during bloom. This is key. So this product can be used all the way from start to finish. We know a lot of people use this as a cleanup application towards the end of production to be sure that plants stay nice and clean even once they go into retail. But at the same time, we know that people also can utilize it throughout the growing season. Minimal treatment interval is 14 days. And then the maximum number of applications per year is 6. Maximum consecutive applications is 2. And then that maximum yearly application per acre is the 21.25 ounces. You'll notice that things are a little bit different when it comes to the nursery and the restrictions there. So do not make more than one application during bloom. And this really has a lot to do with the pollinator side of things. And we don't want to exceed more than 5.5 ounces per acre. The minimum treatment interval is 14 days, similar or same as the greenhouse, but the maximum number of applications per year is actually 4. Maximum consecutive applications is also 2, and then the yearly applications per acre is that 21.25 ounces. So some other information. XXpire is extremely fast acting. So within 9 hours, most insects are controlled or stop feeding. So aphids start to die within minutes, Lepidopterans stop feeding. XXpire is dry and reduces the risk to beneficial insects at around the 3-hour mark. Whiteflies and other sap-feeding insects start to become affected around the 6-hour mark. And then pests are controlled or stop feeding at the 9-hour mark, making this an extremely fast acting insecticide. And then at 12 hours is the REI, or the reentry period for that product. Long lasting. We know that products that last longer are obviously serve our growers the best. And so being able to have products that are xylem mobile will actually help that product move up into the plant, into the new growth. As that plant continues to grow, it will also continue to, the product will also protect the plant. And so that's great. And then translaminar activity really helps move the surface level inside the leaf. And so why is that important? Well, it controls insects out of the direct line of spray. And this really becomes excellent residual activity after that initial application. So not only was the application targeted at the pest, but then there's also the secondary side of things where once the insects are feeding onto the plant, they're actually able to be affected as well. And so you see here in the diagram, you can see how that product moves up into the plant. So long lasting residual activity, obviously it's going to be dependent on the different types of pests, but we have up to 4 weeks against certain pests. So green peach aphids, 4 weeks, chili thrips, 2 weeks, silverleaf whitefly, 2 weeks, and lepidopters about 2 weeks. So XXpire comes in a concentrated water dispersible granule. It's in a 16-ounce package, can be used to make up to 800 gallons of spray solution. It's an easy measuring device attached to the top, and less storage space is needed for this formulation. So it's very easy to use. It's concentrated water dispersible granule, like I mentioned, but is consistent particle size, low dust, easy to pour and measure. And what I think is probably one of the best things is that it's really rapid to complete dispersion within water, within seconds of it touching water. So how do we use this? So it can be used alone in a tank mix, apply as a foliar spray just to the point of runoff. That's really up to around that 200 gallon per acre mark, and then can be applied with air blast sprayers. Uniformly covers the upper and lower leaf surface for optimum control. And then adjuvants can optimize control on most insects. I will say though, even though the adjuvants can always add a competitive advantage, it's not always necessarily required. I know I managed our research facility greenhouses for a number of years, and I didn't use a lot of adjuvants and still had really good results from XXpire. So kind of depends on your program if you decide to utilize adjuvants or not. So talk a little bit about how to use. I've kind of talked a little bit about the rates in general, but we want to drill this down just a little bit further. And so there are several different rates that can be used, and it really has to do with the insect that you're trying to control. We'll see this a lot in diseases, in weeds, and also in insecticides, where there are different rates associated to what you're trying to control. So you have different options. So at the 2 to 2 3/4 ounce per 100 gallon rate, or the 4 to 5.5 ounce per acre, you're going to control your aphids, your Lepidoptera, your sap feeding beetles, mealybugs, shoreflies, slagus bugs, and thrips. However, if you're looking to take out some of the other things like white flies and some scale or gull midge, The 2.7 per 100 is going to probably be a better fit. And then other things like spider mites and scale species really are much better controlled at the high rate of 3.5 ounces per 100. So when to use? We talked a little bit, Amy covered a little bit about when should we be treating pests, and you should always be treating pests, at the early stages. And so in this case, we're going to talk about when they first appear. You want to be following those insecticide resistance management guidelines that we talked about earlier. You don't want to make more than 2 consecutive groups and then rotate to a class of chemistry outside of the group 4s and group 5s. And of course, always follow the label instructions. So here's just a few different pests listed on the label and some more key timings to when you should be making those applications. So in this case, we're talking about some elm and willow beetles, and apply in the spring and summer when feeding is observed. Bagworms apply when the bags are small and larvae are still actively feeding. Lace bugs before the populations become severe, and might need to make a couple of applications 14 days apart. Lepidoptera is another one. When scouting indicates target pests have reached an economic threshold, certainly is the time to spray. Scale is much, much, much easier to control at the time of crawler stage. It's really hard to control once it gets past that. Spider mites, when they first observed prior to webbing and before populations have become severe, again, adjuvants offer an excellent opportunity to enhance this application. I will say I've done both of spider mites with webbing and also without, and still saw satisfactory results. Whitefly, be sure to apply when first observed before populations have become severe. Adjuvants, again, will also enhance that control for extended control. Make 2 applications 14 days apart. We know what's coming up on poinsettia season. I was out at the grower this week, and they were sticking poinsettias, so whitefly won't be too far behind. So again, XXpire offers an excellent opportunity. If you've not used XXpire in a poinsettia production, it is a lights out for whitefly. So in summary, we have the 2 active ingredients, both sulfoxaflor and spinetoram. We have 2 different modes of action, reduces the resistance risk, controls more than 39 insects, 7 of the top 10 nursery and greenhouse pests, minimal to phytotoxic risk to plants, less disruptive to beneficials, fast acting, long lasting with up to 4 weeks on certain pests. And so we've covered a lot of information today, but hopefully you guys have found some information that is beneficial for you and making decisions on your next rotation plan. If you have more questions about Corteva products, feel free to scan the QR code. You can get product updates and product label information and any other agronomic solutions we have there on our website. And if any of you that have additional questions, we've got a few minutes. We'll be happy to look in the Q&A section and take any of your questions. But if anybody has any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is there. And I definitely wanted to thank Amy for joining me today. It's always a pleasure for you and I to get together and work on something that I feel like we're both pretty passionate about. And so again, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Brock.
Yeah, absolutely. And is anybody monitoring the Q&A side of things?
Yeah, you want me to read some questions to you?
Yeah, we got some.
Okay, so we have a question here. What do you mean? I think we've answered this one, but what do you mean have similar residual activity? So that one we talked a little bit about with resistance management. So we talked about, you don't want something that's got a 7-day reapplication interval with a 21-day. So make sure they're closer together. Another question, is XXpire compatible with bioagents? So what looks like that one disappeared. Oh, we answered that. Okay. So do you want to address that, Brock, or do you want me to?
Yeah, I'll take it. I mean, so I think here from a bioagent perspective, there's not a lot of compatibility issues because, with biopesticides and mixing this in. The real issues where we see issues coming from are really when you're mixing XXpire with like bioorganisms, like predatory insects in your facilities. So the biopesticides tend to be a little bit on the safer side.
Okay. Do you recommend adding an IGR?
Ooh, that's a good one. So if it was an IGR by itself, yes, because what you're going to do is you're going to notice that you're going to be able to take care of some of the immediate pest with the spray. And then you'll also, then anybody who's younger and coming along would certainly be that would be an okay strategy. I'd like that one actually. Even though earlier I might have mentioned the fact that there's not a lot of things you need to tank mix with Expire, and IGR was a good example of one that I could get behind.
Okay. What about Expire registration in California? You want to address that?
Oh my goodness, Amy, do we have another hour? Actually, so there's a little bit of information we can talk a little bit about. We are continuing to go down the road of looking at opportunities outside of, or actually in the state of California. But certainly it is really tied to sulfoxaflor. And so as Corteva continues to go down that road and have conversations, we'll see what the options are. But I know that there still are conversations, and we'll have an update as this proceeds and goes through some of the hurdles that has to be with California.
Okay,
Amy, unless you got something else to go along with that.
Nope, that's good. Here's a good one. How about the new thrips in Florida? Talk about what you've seen there.
Man, oh man, oh man, you are hitting the product. So this thing is lights out on the new thrips down in Florida. So Conserve and Expire were listed at the top list of the two insecticides that show the most control. What was really interesting, there's a tremendous amount of work being done by the University of Florida, and there is great information slide decks out there that rank all of the pesticides that should be used and should not be used in a rotation. So I would encourage you to look. Feel free to reach out to me. I can forward you information, or you can do a University of Florida search by that thrip species, and you'll come up with the slide deck. But no joke, lights out for growers. In fact, we know that Expire and Conserve both saved countless acres of crop the last several years.
Can you explain the crawler stage on scale and what to look for?
I'm gonna let you take that one, Amy.
Yeah, so I would just say it is exactly as it's described crawler. So before those scales, exoskeleton hardens, and they pretty much become static or in one place on the leaf, they're crawling or moving around. So at that stage before they have the harder exoskeleton is when you, or armor is when you want to treat them. So as they're the youngest of the scales. What about did phyto trials extend to recently stuck unrooted cuttings or tissue culture, or just finished crops? That's a good question. Some of this was before my time, but I can certainly look and follow up with that question. Lindsay, we can get back to you on that one, because a lot of it was probably finished crops, but I'm sure across IR4 we had some of all of it.
And I think the other one, just as we know that poinsettia, when colored brack is kind of the more susceptible, especially across like other pesticides. And so that was definitely a target for us as well, to be sure that we captured. And I know that there's data and safety with colored bracks.
Yes, for sure. Does it have an effect on nematodes? I can answer this. No, these are insecticides, and we shouldn't have any activity on any nematodes. Let's see, can serve as a drench or spray for thrips as a foliar application. Is Corteva working on adding drone application permissions to their product labels? I think just like all companies, we're investigating all types of application methods, especially what's coming down the road. So that's a big technology and part of R&D for all of our organizations right now.
Yeah, and I think that we're going to see, I mean, there's obviously in the ag sector, there's a lot of interest in drone applications. Nursery and in greenhouse is no different. So yeah, I think, and in fact, we've had as far back as 4 or 5 years ago, we've been involved in researching drone and how it fits into application technology. So I think it's coming for sure.
Do you have a preference on the best type of adjuvant to use?
Oh, so again, I kind of mentioned it, I hinted at it a little bit before. So I've been a non-adjuvant kind of guy for a number of years. However, capsule's probably been my go-to when we've absolutely needed to use something from an adjuvant perspective. Much past that, just don't have the experience and trial side of things, to be honest.
Okay. Will the program be recorded? Yes. The answer to that is yes. It has been recorded. And I believe that's all of it. Oh, one last question. Brock, I'm sure you've had this question before. Are you related to the great game show host
Wink? Yeah, I knew it. Yeah. When you've had this question before, I knew it was coming. And not to my knowledge, but a good catch though. Well, I thank you everybody who joined us today. First off, I love the fact that there was a lot of questions for us to answer, and we're glad we got through them all. But if you guys have any other questions, feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to answer questions. We know we're only a few weeks away from Cultivate in July, so stop by the Corteva booth and visit with our team. We'd love to share with some information. We've got some new products being launched this year, and we'd love to see you out at the show. So see you guys throughout the year, and hope we can connect soon. Thanks.